So welcome to this evening's People, Place and Community Seminar, and our speaking this evening is Alison Norton. Alison is a PhD candidate in medieval history and archaeology at Canterbury Christchurch University. Her research focuses on rural normal castles in the English Southwest, where she applies historical, archaeological and GIS methods to answer questions regarding how movement, visibility and accessibility within local landscapes influence castle sitting patterns. So over to you, Alison.
Let me share the screen, which is this one. Yes?
Yeah.
Yeah. Real. Okay. I'm going to stand and sort of pivot this for a minute. Right. So thank you for coming and listening to my talk tonight, and thank you so much, Ruth and the IHR, for inviting me. I'm going to be talking about two castles tonight that I research. My PhD is in its final stages, which I can say somewhat fine. And I look, as Ruth said, I look at Devon and Dorset as my main counties for the Southwest. So oh, maybe we'll move it this way. Yes. Okay. So tonight I'm going to be talking about one of the questions I look at. I can't go into everything that I do for my research, mainly due to time. So everyone is going to get this sort of overall snapshot of the methodology and some of the things I consider. The main question I want to address tonight is, how did local and regional landscapes impact castle siting decisions? And what I mean by that, is there a pattern that's sort of reoccurring throughout the Southwest, mainly Devon and Dorset, or are patterns that I'm noticing more localized? Are they for specific landscape features? I do a regional study mainly because I want that comparative analysis. I want to know how widespread some of these patterns might be, or how focused they are. Is it castle dependent, castle builder dependent, etc. With regional studies for castles, we have a few. Some of the ones that people might be the most familiar with would be Lydiard, who looks at East Anglia, or Lowry, who does the Southeast Mids. Those are the two that are sort of the bog standard regional studies in which someone can sort of build from. For the Southwest, we don't have any regional studies. We have very specific focused research in the castle discipline. With Devon, it's mainly Robert Higham. For Dorset, anecdotal. We have Corfe and Wareham that sort of lead the research for Dorset. There isn't a systematic study at all for it. So this is the first one. Hopefully it does very well. And I wanted that broad research that's been done for Devon, and I wanted a comparatively more well-studied county to sort of base some of the stuff I'm finding in Dorset. That way it's a nice comparison. However, what we're still getting in Devon is very anecdotal as well. It's usually Exeter, Oakhampton, Barnstable's thrown in there a little bit, sometimes Totnes, but Exeter and Oakhampton are the main ones. I look at rural timber castles. And what do I mean by that? I mean sites that, to my knowledge, have not transitioned to stone. Started as timber, ended as timber. They can form a motte and bailey, which is one that's typically found, mottes, ringworks, what have you, but did not largely, if at all, incorporate stone into any of the architectural fabric. My period is 1066, 1200, sort of on a wider scale. We see after 1200, a lot of castles tend to transition to that masonry structure that everyone equates with a castle. Those curtain walls, those mural towers, those gatehouses. So in this period, we're seeing a lot of timber structures. After this period, not really. I look at sites with little to no text-based evidence. Now, with this, there's a bit of a problem that has occurred traditionally in castle studies. There's little to no text-based evidence, and that comes from the history or archaeological side. They tend to get slotted into very general narratives. For example, the castle was sited atop a hill. Okay, well, widespread visibility must have been an influencing factor in constructing the castle itself. Castle was built near a river, trade and communication. That must have influenced castle siting decisions. What you're doing, or what scholars have typically done when sort of slotting these sites into these narratives, is diminish the uniqueness of local landscapes, the communities within those local landscapes. It also diminishes the uniqueness and individuality of the castle itself, that there has to be a reason castle builders selected this particular site. There has to be a reason why they constructed it in such a manner, other than there's a hill, let's build on top of that. It just doesn't really equate in my mind as that simple. It also, and I'll get to some of the landscape factors a little bit later. These sites are also sort of dependent upon archaeological research with excavation. Excavation is quite costly. So in the past, they've again just been slotted into patterns that scholars have found on a wider scale. So I really wanted to focus on these to figure out a way to incorporate them into some narrative, whether that be a local or regional, county-based, what have you. I wanted to find a way to sort of give them that individuality that they have. How do I do that? I supplement what historical and archaeological evidence I have with computational approaches, which is namely GIS and LiDAR. As I said, the castles themselves may not be referenced in any sort of historical documentation. You might just have secondary material, but the landscape does. The landscape, the place names, the place itself, the manor might be mentioned in Doomsday. And I sort of generate some sort of context, some sort of framework for that landscape to sort of figure out how it's structured. What are some of the characteristics we have? How are these influencing castle siting decisions? And with GIS and LiDAR, I look specifically at movement, accessibility, and visibility. Movement, how are people moving through the landscape? Are castle builders siting in well-trafficked areas? Accessibility, well, if they aren't, how accessible is this castle? If we're looking at, for example, an urban castle, and it has a Roman wall, typically we would find the castle sort of slotted within one of the corners with the Roman wall forming part of its boundary. It's not very accessible, but doesn't need to be. And I'm sort of questioning all these different factors. And with the theory of visibility of castles are meant to be seen. By whom? At what point? Is it a continuous visibility that we're supposed to have with it? And so I look at different theories through least cost path, fuzzy view sheds, and view sheds. I do have images to back these up, so it's okay if you're looking at them and go, I don't know what you're talking about. These are just foreign things to me. Least cost path is essentially a tool to predict movement. How did someone move from point A to point B? And you can generate a whole host, a wide range of factors that might have influenced or discouraged movement from point A to point B. For me, some of the factors that I use would be the landscape itself, the slope of the landscape. I don't know about you, but if the slope is way too steep, I will find another way. And I factor that in. I look at what factors would I think would have encouraged movement within this period. So doomsday boroughs, I think would have encouraged movement. They're political, economic focal points within the landscape. I think they would have wanted to move through there. Castles that are known to have been constructed within this period, well, we know they were moving through them because we have a castle. But things that would have discouraged them. For me, I'm going to go with rivers. I know they would have used rivers. I'm very well aware that that they were a thing that facilitated movement. However, We don't know what the shape of those rivers would have been. We don't know at what point these rivers would have been navigable. Are they seasonal? So do we see, for example, with the River Lid in Devon, at most, it is a trickle. It is a stream with an identity crisis of a river. Nothing is moving through that. But come winter, when the rain is coming from Dartmoor, no, okay, yes, I can see that. So there's just a lot of unknown factors for us to consider, or for me to consider for rivers. So I take them out of the analysis itself. But I do use bridges and fords. We know they would have used them. I encourage movement across them. Fuzzy view sheds. Essentially, if anyone is familiar with the regular view shed, which Lowry does talk about in his regional study, we have numerous view shed analyses within Castle Studies themselves. Lydiard does use them. View sheds are binary though. From this particular height, so if I'm doing my view shed at this height, facing this direction, this is visible to me. This is not. But it only calculates binary. Something is either visible or it's not. There's no in between. Fuzzy view sheds look at the in between. It looks at clarity. So if I'm moving away from something, I'm getting less clarity of that structure, of that person, of that place. And it tells me at what point the clarity is declining. At what point is it kind of weather dependent? Is it seasonal? And it just adds to that extra layer of analysis when it comes to visibility. And I use LiDAR. Anyone who's looked at rural castles or visited rural castles, woodland covers them pretty often. And try as I might, I cannot see through that. No amount of site visits will make that site any clearer than it already is. LiDAR, however, especially the digital terrain models, take away those features. It creates this bare earth model. It takes away surface features like vegetation. It takes away buildings, and it leaves you with what the terrain looks like. Take a sip of water real quick. And there you go. There's a digital terrain model right there. So Coleridge will be my first case study for this evening. This is a site in Devon. It is covered in woodland. We can see the site. And I'm just going to use the pointer to show you, which I cannot on that computer. Is there a...
It would be difficult because you won't be able to show the people online.
That's fine. I'm gonna use my words.
Yeah.
So you see the Mott and Bailey there. There's a sort of curved feature right coming straight off the Mott, and a larger curved feature with a right angle off to the east of the castle. It could be that those are inner and outer Baileys. It's unclear because this site has been continuously timbered right up until the 90s, which is why we see these weird distorted features on the Mott itself, this right angle. That was an access road used by the timber companies. But it sits on a ridge. There's a few access routes along that ridge. It sits right beside the River Taw. And its surrounding landscape is farmland, both a mixture of agricultural and pastoral. Give you some background. Coleridge is Mott and Bailey. It's located roughly 20 kilometers northeast of Oakhampton. Sits adjacent to the River Taw. Not mentioned at all in historical documentation. The castle itself, not mentioned. It has not been excavated. The only archaeological research that has been conducted has been the initial surveys needed to make it a scheduled ancient monument. And all that has done is, at what point do we see earthwork features start to show signs of erosion, or what's the condition of the earthwork? What are the measurements of it? That's about all the information we get out of these surveys. But Coleridge, the manor, is mentioned in Doomsday. And it's mentioned that it's a manor held by Geoffrey, the Bishop of Coutances. Disclaimer, that does not mean he built it. It just means that this manor is mentioned in Doomsday. It was a known place by 1086. Does not mean he built it. We have no idea who built these castles. I'm just gonna throw that knowledge in right now. So let's look at the place name evidence. Coleridge is charcoal ridge. Lee, just a common Old English word that signifies there's woodland, and loose bear loosely translates to a place where pigs are pastured. So this is quite revealing. Coleridge with charcoal. Well, charcoal is a main source of fuel at this time. So it's a very valuable thing to have. The production of it adds a sensory element as well. In order to produce charcoal, you have two ways. You can bury it and make charcoal pits, or you can use coppice wood to make these conical shapes and burn them slowly. At any point, though, you must release smoke through a chimney. Otherwise, the charcoal won't burn correctly, or it will just sort of deteriorate to ash. So it's a very interactive process. So you can have 7 of these conical things, conical stacks going at the same time. The burners are living around there to maintain it. We know there's woodland with Lee, and we know pigs have to have woodland. If it's acorn producing trees, that's their food source. If there's particular types of trees like holly, that is a winter food source used for livestock, and it's continuous pasture. So what would that look like then for the landscape? So we have the castle in the sort of bottom corner of what I've determined is the boundary of the theoretical woodland. And the present day community of Coleridge, I'm not entirely certain if that's where the medieval community was. That is currently where the village of Coleridge sits today. And then we have what is now East Wesley and Loose Bear. So within this area, I'm saying there's woodland. I'm saying there's a production of charcoal going on. This is a big economic center, big resource center. So what does that then mean for the movement? Fine that there's woodland, but how are people accessing the castle? How are they moving through this area? Let's see. Oh, did it? It's not moving. There it goes. Okay. And so this is what my least cost paths then do. The white lines are predicted routes. Those are the least cost path analyses. So those are the predicted movement that I've generated. The solid black line are Roman roads. And then you see a dashed line coming off the side. That is a known medieval route. And that's a route that was generated from charter bounds. Don't know the name of it. Don't know if it had a name. It's a very fragmented road because the charters end. So that's all I have of the medieval route itself. But coming through Coleridge, there's the Roman road, the predicted routes. And the predicted routes are moving northwest from Exeter. And it's going through Crediton. It's the seat of the bishop before the cathedral was built and moved to Exeter. Copplestone Cross, known market town. And it's moving all the way up to Barnstable, which is a big port city. If you looked at the bottom of the screen, you see this Roman road kind of going along the bottom, and that's heading towards Oakhampton. So if we think about the castle, we have potentially medieval travel because the medieval road is sort of following that line of the Roman, and the predicted routes are following the line of the Roman. We potentially have a well-trafficked area of people moving to and from Exeter, Oakhampton, Crediton, Copplestone Cross, and just sort of off the screen to the northwest would be Winkley. And Winkley has 2 castles, and it is held by the king, and it's parkland. So it's sitting right in a pretty well-trafficked area. So if I move just a little bit in focus with the actual theoretical woodland, you see that the predicted path, that white line, sort of forks away from the Roman road and hooks southwest down to the castle. Okay. So if we look in that sort of defined area with the predicted route being a boundary, Castle, Wesley, Eastleigh, Lewsbury. To me, I think this is where the production's happening. I think this is where the charcoal burning is taking place. And if we have bishops, the king, and pretty high lords in the Norman world, all setting up shop around this area, I think it's a very busy, very well sought after product that Coleridge is producing. And it's supplying this fuel to Winkley Manor. It could be shipped all the way up to Barnstable. It's shipped to Oakhampton, Crediton, Copplestone Cross, which is the market town, and all the way down to Exeter. So I think it has to have some sort of large wooded area. I don't know if this is contiguous woodland, but it has to be a wooded area in order to produce this much charcoal. And I think just a little bit above that predicted route where the present day Coleridge is, could be where the settlement would have been, where that community would have been. But my question is now, okay, there's a pretty decent amount of production going on. Wouldn't castle builders want to have visibility over that? Is that why they're citing where they were? Because we think on a natural landscape, Coleridge sits on a higher plateau. Naturally, its elevation is higher. So I'm kind of curious to know why perhaps they didn't choose that spot if visibility over this production was its primary siting factor. So I did what we call a cumulative viewshed. This, well, it's yellow on my screen, but this sort of mustardy yellow is what the castle can see, is what's visible from the castle. The green is what's visible from both the castle and Coleridge, and the orange is what's visible from Coleridge. As I thought, there's more coverage, shall we say, more visible coverage from Coleridge of this production area, of this resource, of this wooded landscape. But what is not visible from Coleridge and what is visible from the castle is Brushford, is that bridge. So this now has me thinking perhaps castle builders were not so concerned with having visibility over the resources. They instead wanted targeted visibility of people moving to and from this area. They wanted targeted visibility of that product moving out, people coming in, because it is very visible from that castle and it is not from Coleridge. And we also have to think there's some seasonality happening here. You know, in order to get coppice wood, you have to seasonally manage the woodland. There's also charcoal being produced. So we have that smell, we have the sounds of it sort of burning and popping, the smoke sort of distorting some visibility, which is why, again, I don't think they're moving further down in that area of Wesley and Eastleigh, because that's where the production is happening. That's where it would sort of deter movement. So Brushford, I think, is perhaps why castle builders selected that. It is a very targeted view away, but it's also the castle's in proximity to the production. So it may not need to see it, but just being near it in the proximity, it has that sort of control through just the audible sounds of the burning, the production, the charcoal cracking. So we're now going to move on to Dorset and talk about East Chelborough. You're going to see two LiDAR images, and there's a reason for it. If you put them together, the image becomes insanely distorted, and it's horrible to look at. So I've separated the two because it is so much better. But essentially, these are sort of side by side. The settlement does sit right on that hill that's coming west off of the Motte and Bailey. But on the image of the right, there's a circle, this big oval shape, that is the Motte. You can see some damage to it. I don't know how it looks on your screen, but on mine, there's two craters kind of on top of it. And then there's this sort of half circular chunk taken off of the eastern side of the Motte itself. And then you have this just gobbledygook looking thing off to the north of it, that was the Bailey. It is no more. It's been mined out completely. And I'll get to why in the next slide. But the Mott, and at the time Bailey, sits on this sort of teardrop looking ridge. And then you go down the hill ever so slightly to the west, and you hit this medieval settlement. I don't see a reason why these did not exist at the same time. I think they did. There's no evidence to say this settlement post-dated the castle or vice versa. So I think they existed at the same time. And we see, I put an ordnance survey map on it to kind of help with the earthworks. We see about 8 or so crofts and tofts, which are earthwork remnants to show that they were dwellings and sort of little gardens off to it. So we see 2 halves of a medieval settlement, and splitting those 2 segments is a road. And that road is medieval, which I think eventually just led straight up to the Mott and Bailey. Right. East Shelburne is a Mott and Bailey located roughly 11 kilometers northeast of Beaminster. I'm not sure how your Dorset geography knowledge is. I'm going to assume fantastic. And you'll know what Beaminster is. If you don't, it's about halfway between, it probably sits kind of halfway between Bridport and East Shelburne. Very rural out there, so. The castle itself has no known historical documentation. It was not excavated, but in 1989, Carenza Lewis did do a survey, which is why we have that kind of interpretation of the settlement itself. That was from her works, the investigation she did. The manor was mentioned in Doomsday, held by Roger Barrington. Again, disclaimer, that does not mean he built it. It just means, again, this is a recognized place in 1086. Okay. Again, let's go with some place name evidence. Chelbridge, Chalk Hill. This is why the Bailey no longer exists. It sits right on a chalk bedrock, and the chalk is mined completely out of the Bailey. So the Bailey no longer exists because they were mining the chalk. We have Melbury Bub, multicolored fortification associated with the Bub family. Fortification might throw you off a little bit. That does not mean that there was a sort of tower palisade-esque feature. It could mean that there was a natural mound, prehistoric site that people just gave the term fortification to, which is that burr element. Frampisham, River Meadow, that southern accent's coming out. River Meadow, where wild garlic grows. Put that accent way down. Corscombe, a valley of the stream Corey, Housestock, farmstead belonging to a church, which is in this case Sherborne Abbey. What does this tell us? Well, it does give me a sense of when people are traveling. So if we think about multicolored, what could that mean? Well, if there was a sort of structured, palisaded, defensive feature, perhaps it was externally decorated. That could be one reason why we have the multicolored association. I, however, think it's more of a natural multicoloring, that there's a sense of flora coming up, blooming. I think because of the chalk and the limestone that's there, we're getting some white subsoils being churned up with the farming that's happening. We know it's a farmstead. We know there's farming happening. So I think it's a multicolored natural landscape. And if we look at Rampisham, garlic, the leaves and the actual garlic itself, from late March to October is when these are blooming and flowering. So I think based on all of this sort of natural association that we have with the place names, that people are really moving through this area late March to October. This is when the traffic really ramping up, and this is how people are associating these place names because they're happening to see it in these spring and summer times. When you turn up chalk is very porous. we get a watery landscape. We get these streams like course them. So with this area, I'm thinking it's a very natural farming area. I think people are moving through it between that late March, October period, and it's a very watery landscape. But with the chalk, as I said, they're mining out the chalk on the site. That's why the Bailey is gone. If you're building a castle, you're going to hit the same thing. The chalk is a very valuable building material, so there's an economic way of sort of benefiting from it. But also, if you're siting the castle right on top of it, you're probably, when you're constructing it, digging the ditches, you're adding some sort of chalky subsoil. So more than likely, the earthwork itself has a sort of white tinge on it, this chalk tinge. You're also probably using it as beam filler or some sort of plaster with the timber structure. So think of East Chelborough in the medieval landscape as this white beacon, this very whitened castle. And kind of just to give you a sense of where this is at. So within that East Chelborough, West Chelborough, Melbury, Grantham area, think of it as a very natural landscape with farming. And then this kind of corner of that triangle is this massive castle with whitened earthworks and a whitened timber tower. Now let's look at the movement. It's a little bit more clustered than Coleridge was. Again, the white is the predicted movement that least cost path. The solid black line is the Roman road, and the dashed are the medieval. So we have quite a lot of movement happening right to the east of Chelborough. It sits in between Bridport, and then you'll see this orange diamond at the top, that's Sherborne Castle. So it sits kind of right in between those two. You have the Ridgeway, that's the medieval road moving south and then west of Shaftesbury, running right along East Chelborough's landscape. We have the Roman road from Dorchester, heading north towards Somerset. We have the Fursey Down road that's again north to south, connecting Yeovil to Dorchester, and East Chelborough is right there. One theory that you could have is perhaps the castle builders wanted to be near-ish. There's no town around that area, so perhaps they wanted to be close enough to this well-trafficked area, this movement that's happening between Bridport, Sherborne, Shaftesbury, Dorchester, and Somerset. So I created a view shed just to see what would happen. Also, very widespread visibility from that castle. But you see at the very bottom, there's this fork where the predicted paths sort of go north and then go west-ish to East Chelborough. Well, that's where those roads were. That's where those convergence of the roads were. And it's not visible at all from East Chelborough. But what is visible is Sherborne Old Castle. And I'm going to head and just nip this in the bud. Sherborne was built after East Chelborough. It did not influence construction in any way. It's built about 30 years after East Chelborough was. However, Sherborne Abbey was there. And this is the fuzzy view shed. So within this green bit, it's where Sherborne Abbey has the most visual clarity, where they have more occasional visibility. This area shows that it's not necessarily weather dependent, that they could still see the castle. And even though it sits right on the edge of that sort of green patch, we have to remember back, it's this whitened earthwork, it's this whitened tower. So it's supplementing the visibility through the building materials. It's very beacon-esque structure. Sherborne Abbey is, we have to think, the Bishop of Salisbury. But if we go back, there's quite a lot of visibility going on in Somerset right there. And because I've studied the Southwest a lot, I had a feeling that Montacute sat right in it. It did. So Montacute Castle was built around the same time as East Chelborough. It was built by Robert, Count of Mortain, the half-brother of William the Conqueror. And again, East Chelborough sits right in that visual clarity zone from the castle. So perhaps it wasn't this need to have widespread visibility of movement, of resources. Perhaps it's more political. Perhaps they chose this site because it allows them visibility of a manor of Robert Count of Mortain, again, half-brother of William the Conqueror. It also allows them to be visible to the Bishop of Salisbury. He's a very influential person at this time. Later would, with Roger, much later than East Chelborough, would control the exchequer. So these are two very powerful figures that the castle builders probably wanted to have intervisibility with, shall we say. And with Dorset, we have the Dorset Downs. So it's not like they could have moved a little closer. You go into a valley and your visibility is cut off. So those are some theories that I'm having at the moment with perhaps why they chose this site. Coming to the final slide, which I hope I have not gone over time. What has this presentation hopefully convinced you of is that computational approaches have generated more targeted questions for castles as a whole and as individual entities. So through these approaches, we have more targeted questions. They're no longer slotted into these general narratives of a hill equates to widespread visibility. There's hills all through England. Can't miss them. Siting near a river means trade and visibility. Well, we're assuming that river hasn't changed in 900 plus years. It's a big assumption. But these approaches that I've shown you have taken the historical and archaeological evidence, created a framework, and tested certain theories from the evidence. And it's shown that castle builders actually had a very clear understanding of local and regional landscapes. They're very familiar with where to site these castles to obtain their objectives. I don't know how they became this clear. Perhaps they scouted it out. Perhaps they're moving much earlier than the castle was constructed and therefore getting an idea of where to site. Maybe they're talking with the locals and getting some knowledge of what's happening in this area. But either way, we now have more targeted questions to generate future research, to generate some sort of localized narrative of these sites that have otherwise been sort of carpeted over. And not only do we have that, we also have the idea that Normans knew the English landscape a lot better than what was previously thought.